think. I'd like to introduce two amazing people. One is Rob Chesnut. He, as I said, he is my much better half. Rob is general counsel of Airbnb, but a very progressive thinker and a wonderful representation, I think, of our better halves. And Jessica Patterson is amazing. She created a product, I would say, that is what I think going to redesign the way that sexual harassment, bullying is going to be reported, and give corporations now the ability, and all of us, to see some repercussions to actions, and not just the reporting, but the tasks after. So with that, I will bring Jessica and Rob up, and thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it, and so does the Battery.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hi, is this on?
Good evening, everybody.
Welcome, everybody. It's so great to be here with you tonight. And, Rob and I, what we really want to do is just have an open and honest conversation about the Me Too movement and sexual harassment in the workplace. It's a really complex issue, and so we're going to be exploring it from a variety of different angles. And, for those of you who are tuning in on the live stream, we are here at the Battery in San Francisco, and many of the members of the audience tonight work in the tech industry. So, what we want to do is talk a little bit specifically about how this issue impacts Silicon Valley and how we can work together to create change here. So I think that what we'd like to do is just have a conversation up here tonight. To start, we have some topics planned, and then we'll make sure to leave a lot of time at the end for audience Q&A. Yes. So I think first we should start with some introductions. So Jillian did a great job introducing us before, but just to kind of share a little bit more. So I am the co-founder of the Purple Campaign, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is really to eliminate sexual harassment in the workplace. And the way we're going about doing that is by establishing relationships with companies to review their internal practices and policies to help them make improvements, and also develop training programs for business leaders and employees. And then we're also working with lawmakers to look at public policy changes that can drive change on a broader scale. So Rob, do you want to share a little bit about your background?
My name's Rob Chesnut. I'm the general counsel at Airbnb. I've been in Silicon Valley for almost 20 years. I spent a number of years as the deputy general counsel at eBay, and I was the general counsel at another public company that's in the education space called Chegg. I began my career as a federal prosecutor in Northern Virginia, and we're both from Virginia, it turns out. So yeah,
alumni of
Alumni
UVA.
of
Wahoo
University
wah!
of Virginia, that's right.
And
We had a bad basketball weekend last weekend,
Yeah.
so we're still
not the best.
we're still getting over that.
Yes. And I actually have spent really the last decade working in Silicon Valley tech companies. So I started my career first working at Accenture in management consulting, and then worked at a startup called Yammer that was acquired by Microsoft, and then most recently was at Instacart, the online grocery delivery service. So I've spent most of my career working in tech, and only recently have made this move into the nonprofit space to really focus on this issue. So I thought that what we could do is just start by, I think it's obvious why I'm up here tonight talking about the Me Too movement, but Rob, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what your connection is to this movement.
There are a couple of things, actually. It really hit me reading things over the last year and a half of bad behavior at companies all around Silicon Valley and all across the country. And I read the first couple, and I thought, wow, what a horrible thing it must be to work at a company like this with that kind of an environment and what it must be like, and then what the lawyers must be dealing with and the problems, because as a lawyer, you first go there. And then it struck me, you know what? I've got a responsibility here. I think that as a general counsel, it's my responsibility to ensure that integrity is really driven into the culture of a company. And it struck me that particularly at Airbnb, you know, Airbnb, the mission of Airbnb is all around helping connect people from all around the world and creating the sense of belonging and connection. And I said, you know, how awful would it be if someone were experiencing sexual harassment at a company whose mission is in fact belonging? And so at that point, I thought, you know, this is something that I need to get involved with, not only just as a human being, but also as a general counsel of the company. And I'll also say that I've been inspired by the love of my life in this regard. You know, Jillian, you know, thanks for the introduction. Jillian has made this a huge part of her life. Some of you may know she has a 911, her phone number, given out all across Silicon Valley for women who are experiencing sexual harassment. She's there for total strangers, any woman that needs help in these circumstances and needs someone to talk to. She's there for them, and she listens, she gives them advice, she helps connect women who have common issues and perhaps even common perpetrators. And boy, the more I started talking to her about this, I was blown away by the scope of the issue. And also, because I've never experienced it directly, really hit by the humanity of it. And hearing Jillian tell me, you know, she would never explain names. Everything that all of her calls are confidential. But just hearing about what some women are going through in the workplace really hit me. So with all that coming together, for me, it was really obvious that this is something I should get involved in.
So let's talk a little bit about the heart of the issue. You know, there's been so much reporting on this issue, so much activity on social media, and I think sometimes it can get a little bit confusing, actually, about what we're really even talking about. You know, what is sexual harassment? What is the Me Too movement? Can we maybe define it for people before we dive deeper into this discussion?
I could take a quick stab at the legal end of things, and then you've obviously got a lot of experience, and you could talk about the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
There are, you know, classically two types of sexual harassment. One is known as quid pro quo, where someone in the workplace is demanding some form of sexual favors in return for something at work. The other is the broader, more subtle type of sexual harassment that deals with an uncomfortable, hostile work environment. And that's the one that, you know, the first to me is so out of bounds that it strikes me as incredible that any of that could even go on. The hostile work environment can get more subtle, and it can be anything from words, actions, looks, even behaviors that among men in the office that are simply observed by women. But if it makes you feel uncomfortable in the workplace and it's sexual in nature, that is also sexual harassment.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, what the Me Too movement has really been all about is the breaking of the silencing of women. You know, there has been just a culture of silencing where women haven't felt comfortable coming forward to share their stories. And, you know, what we've seen with this movement is there's just been millions and millions of courageous women who have finally broken their silence and shared their stories. And what we've found is that a lot of the forms of sexual harassment really come down to an abuse of power. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's interesting, what I didn't understand, I think, when I first you know, got to Silicon Valley was why the silence? In other words, why wouldn't someone report a problem like this? They're being abused in the workplace. There's a hotline, right? So why wouldn't someone take advantage of a hotline? The more I thought about it and talked to folks, though, I've gained now, I think, a better understanding of the dynamic. I think that women feel isolated because they really don't have a safe place to go. And I'll explain why a little bit from the perspective of a company. Even though a company may have a hotline and that it would enable someone to report anonymously, if you're a woman and you're a victim of sexual harassment, if you report it and you use your name, you're afraid of retaliation. because obviously there's a power dynamic going on. So there's someone more senior, someone perceived to have a lot of power who could retaliate against you.
Right.
And so you certainly can understand the reluctance of not giving a name. But if you report anonymously, it then becomes obvious to the perpetrator what's going on. Because if you report anonymously, then what does the HR department do? Well, they're going to do an investigation. They're going to go to the perpetrator and start interviewing them. And then the perpetrator is going to know, they're going to know who reported. And the worst part about it in that situation is that the victim can't really get any protection against retaliation, because no one knows to look out for them in that circumstance. So if they actually don't give their name, they get no protection. And if they give their name, then they're afraid that they're going to be out there alone against someone who's got more power, and often without any proof. So you end up with a real feeling of isolation and helplessness, nowhere to go. And that creates, I think, the heart of the problem here.
Right. And we know that 75% of women who have spoken out against their employers have actually faced that very retaliation that you're talking about. So it's a very real problem that we're seeing in many companies. So I want to talk a little bit about, Silicon Valley's role in this movement. I think, as Jillian mentioned in the introduction, for most of us, this is something we've been facing our whole lives, certainly our entire careers. And, but I think in Silicon Valley, last February, Susan Fowler's blog post came out where she detailed her experience at Uber. And then over the summer, we saw, a variety of venture capitalists who were outed for sexual harassment. And then, in October of last year, the Harvey Weinstein story broke. And I think at that point, a lot of the attention in this Me Too movement really shifted away from Silicon Valley. And it seems like Silicon Valley has not really been at the forefront of the national conversation that's been happening. So I guess I'm curious, to talk a little bit more about what should Silicon Valley's role in this movement be, and what can we do as a community to drive change here?
Right. I think companies have got to stand up and do something. I think traditionally the answer, if you're a company, and the answer I was always taught when I first went out of the government and into the private world was, we have training and we have a hotline. And the training is mandatory. It's required by law. We do the training. We've got the hotline. This is done. Our responsibilities in this area have been taken care of. And the truth is, we failed as companies to address the problem by simply taking those two steps, because those two steps aren't working. It's obvious. And so I think what companies have got to do is we've got to get creative, and we've got to address the problem with, I think, the same sort of ingenuity that we go after with our products. Yeah. And I think, there's some things that can be done.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. This is the center for innovation, the World Center for Innovation. This is the home to so many original thinkers. It's a testing ground for new products and ideas. And so, while this community has made so many contributions to the advancement of society in other ways, from transportation to healthcare, we really should be leading the way on this issue too. We can't accept the innocent bystander role.
Right. Yeah. So I can talk a little bit about a couple of things. And I think, look, we're still exploring this and still learning. But there are a few things I think that we can do better. And I'll start. The first thing I think is training. If you have training, and the training is an online program that you buy from a vendor, and you go through for an hour and you click some boxes, I don't think you're reaching people. And so what we need to do, I think, is we need to drive integrity into the culture of companies. So what we've done at Airbnb, I'll share this a little bit because it's actually been quite striking. We set up a program. It's a 1-hour program, and it's all around integrity and the culture of the company. And the training is 1 hour long, and it's in small groups. And as the general counsel, I've taken it on to do it with everyone in the company. We have 4,000 people. We have offices all over the world. But if you really want to make an impression with people, I think you've got to get specific about what you mean by integrity and specific about what the boundaries are, what's permissible in the workplace or not. And you've got to have a leader go out and do it. And I'll give you a couple of examples of the way that we've gone after it. I take 12 examples. These are real live stories that have come to us in complaints over my career. And I throw them up on the board one by one. And I ask people, is this something that's allowed under our code of ethics? And we talk about it in groups of anywhere between 10 and about 50, 75 people. And it gets quite specific, and I think there's some uncomfortable laughter in the room when the first example gets thrown up. And people are a little bit surprised, like, wow, he's really talking about this. So one of the examples is 8 people from work go out to a bar after work, and somebody says, hey, everybody, let's go to a strip club. Okay? And there's a little bit of silence in the room when we throw that one up on the board. But then we talk about, well, what are the implications of this in the workplace? It's at a bar. It's not even in the office. What does that mean? And what if people want to go to a strip club? Is that something that work should even be regulating? And we have that discussion, and then we talk about what the actual rule is at Airbnb and what you can and can't do. And we talk about it not just directly with things like a strip club. We talk about dating. I throw out the question, can you date someone else at the company? Yes or no? And you'll hear a few people say yes and a few people say no, but people don't even know.
Right.
And I thought, you know what, if people don't know, no wonder there's so much discomfort among men and women. And the answer, of course, is maybe. Right? It's maybe. You can date someone else at the office, and I think I read some study that was 38% of people actually date someone at work, and about half of them actually end up marrying someone that they meet through the office. So at some level, the world, we all want that to be okay. But it's not okay if it's anywhere in a reporting relationship. It's not okay if it's anywhere in a control relationship. And I put it out very clearly. I say that as the general counsel of the company, I can't date anybody at the company. Why not? And why can't I? Or why can't someone like the CFO of a company do it? Well, the CFO is the one handing out the money. They're handing out the headcount. And so as soon as they start dating someone in the company, that automatically creates an issue and impression that there's a conflict of interest. Or as the general counsel, I'm responsible for investigating misbehavior, failure to comply with the law, right? So how can I do that effectively if I'm actually having a relationship with someone in some area of the company? Can't do it. Can't do it. But I think having these sort of specific conversations, we call it intentional integrity. Let's have a conversation about the specifics. Let's talk about dating. Let's talk about alcohol. Let's talk about the things that relate to integrity and make sure that we all have a common understanding. Because I go around the world, there are different cultures. It's a different conversation in marketing, the marketing conversation versus the engineers, versus the folks in customer service. Very different in France versus Dublin versus China. And so I've done about 40 of them so far. But the interesting thing about them is that they're all different. But I was amazed. I was worried that people would think that it would come across like we're somehow preachy a little bit, or in this about morals. And folks, we do these, we do surveys, anonymous surveys afterwards, and overwhelmingly people say, you've cleared up so much about things that I've always wondered, and no one knows. And having it come from a leader in the company is critical, because we know that the company's serious about it, and we know this is a message that comes from the top, and everybody's living with it.
That's so true. I think that so often, all of the onus is put on the HR department. And it really does need to come from the leadership, so that people are hearing directly from them and they're making clear, what the values of the company are and what the policies are.
Right.
And so, you mentioned that the answer was different in France versus in Dublin versus marketing versus engineering. How do you're a global company. How do you manage those differences but still hold everyone accountable to the same values?
Right. I'll tell you, the answers are not different, but the questions are different.
Okay.
The things that people focus on, right?
Right.
The things that the questions that you get, the tough ones, are very different depending on the group. But the key thing is the answer is the same everywhere.
Yeah.
We all have the same rules that we abide by, all around the world, all the different pockets. But the key thing is, I think, in so many companies, people sort of assume it. I often will start out the sessions by saying, how many people here in the room have integrity? And everyone raises their hand, right? But then when you actually start getting into the specifics of what you mean by integrity and what is allowed and what shouldn't be allowed, that's when it all breaks down. That's when folks are like, well, I'm not really sure what I should be doing in that circumstance. What are the rules around alcohol, for example? And they look at me and are saying, well, I really don't know. Does the company have a voice in what I'm drinking and how much I drink?
Right.
And it's fascinating to hear how everyone believes that they're a good person and trying to do the right thing, but how it breaks down when people start talking about, well, what do you mean by doing the right thing, and getting into the specifics.
Yeah. And so I think that having this internal dialogue inside your company is so important because, as you pointed out, people don't always know the right answers to these questions, and it takes talking about them to really, kind of gain clarity on what is in and out of bounds, as you mentioned. What are some other things that you think companies can do to really drive change and make sure that their workplaces are, safe, inclusive, and equitable for everyone?
Yeah. I'm going to go one more that relates back to the talks. It has to start at the top of the company. And in our particular case, it started with a conversation with the founders.
Yeah.
And then it went to the rest of the executive staff. Because I said, I'm not going to go out and do these presentations all around the world, and I'm not going to talk about integrity if the folks who are founding the company and who are the executives aren't going to live by it. That's the worst thing you could do. Better to say nothing.
Yes.
Right? Than to go out and say one thing and have the leadership act another way. So you've got to start with getting alignment at the very top of the company. The top leaders of the company have to all be aligned around what the rules and the behaviors are going to be, and everybody's got to say, I'm going to live by it.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to say, I agree, and if I don't live by it, I'll accept the consequences like anyone else. So you have to start, I think, with that alignment. Then you have to have, I think, a very visible show somehow from the leadership of the company that this is important, and a dialogue around what you mean by integrity and be intentional about it.
Right.
I think that's at the start of it.
Yeah. And what about things like, having more women in leadership? I think that, the data shows that companies that do have more women in leadership have fewer instances of sexual harassment.
I was stunned. We were talking earlier, and you told me that you started working at a company, and there were 40 people at the company, and you were the first woman who was not an executive assistant there.
Yeah.
That, to me, that is a ripe grounds for problems. Right? And I think that if you want to ward off problems, the more women you have in leadership, or the more balance you have in leadership, by the way, I think diversity in leadership, I think, is critical.
Yeah.
And that, I think, will serve you well in preventing problems. If you have if you had an all-men leadership team, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to have sexual harassment issues. But boy, I think the opportunity and problem is there. And I think there's no safe place for a woman in that kind of a circumstance. So yeah. I think there needs to be in a company, and there should be multiple.
Yeah. And, I think there's almost no company that's going to be completely safeguarded from dealing with these issues. So, what, as a general counsel, what advice can you offer for companies that do face an incident? What should they do when a claim is brought forward?
Right. I think when a claim is brought forward about sexual harassment, the company's watching.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you have to know that people are looking to see what you're going to do. It's not one person that's just bringing a claim alone, I think. I think that in situations where I've seen it, a number of people know that something's going on. It now gets thrown to the company, the HR, and through the legal department. What are you going to do? It's a moment of truth, really, because if you fail there, then the culture's in huge trouble. And I think you're in danger of problem after problem.
Right.
So you obviously have to thoroughly investigate a matter. If there's any issue at all, bring in an independent investigator.
Right.
That way, you can feel and everyone can understand that this wasn't something that was biased by internal relationships. And when you do have findings, one thing that's troubled me about the movement is learning about the silencing of victims as part of these cases. We've already talked about it internally and said we will never require a victim to be silent as part of any deal that we do. We should be willing to live with however we've handled the case. We should be able to look at the situation and say, we've investigated this properly, we've come to the right decision, we're satisfied with the punishment, and we should not be silencing anyone. I mean, look what's happened now with our president. Would anyone, if someone did want to go out and speak, would we actually try to file a lawsuit to stop them from speaking? Of course not. I would never want to be in that position. So I think I'd rather be on the side of transparency and openness. So if there are any sort of a resolution that we come to in a case, we're going to be open about it, and the victim will be free to speak as he or she would like in that case.
Yeah. And I think that, just a moment and we'll get to questions, but I think that, another thing that's so important when there is an investigation going on is really making sure that the company is communicating back to the person who actually filed the claim about, where they are in the process. Set expectations up front about, how long the investigation is supposed to take, and then what the outcome is and any consequences as well. And then, I think, though, that a question comes up is, what sort of duty does the company have to communicate about that to the rest of the employees? Or what duty do they have to actually keep that very confidential?
Right. That's a challenging situation, and I'd love to tell you that we've figured that one out.
Right.
I certainly have come to the conclusion that we would never silence a victim.
Yeah.
In any one of the circumstances. A victim should be free to talk. I don't yet know, and I think we've also decided that if someone is a victim of the harassment, that they should be told about what the results of the case are. We're still struggling with situations where maybe it's a bystander or someone who thinks that they see something or heard something and they report it. It's not something that companies typically go out and publish a report on.
Right.
These are typically, HR matters are typically handled in very private fashions. But there's a real danger to that, right? We'll never be in a situation, I don't ever want to see us in a situation where there's a perpetrator and we found that they are responsible for sexual harassment and found that they're guilty, and that they continue to remain at the company under this cloak of silence, continuing to be able to act as they wish. That's unacceptable.
And it seems like rather than exposing the details of a specific incident to the rest of the employees, it's really mostly important that leadership communicates to employees about what their principles are and what they're going to hold any employee accountable to. So, not going into specifics about any particular case, but more just talking broadly about here are policies, here are principles, here's how we investigate when there is an incident brought forward, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable to these principles regardless of who is involved in the case.
Yes, I think a board of directors plays an important role here too. We've had some good talks with our board, and I think having a board play an active role in this is critical. So one thing that we do with our board of directors is, well, the first thing is I'm made aware of every complaint involving our code of ethics that gets filed. I get a regular briefing every other week on any new cases that are filed, and I'm told and made apprised of all the progress on the investigation. And so there's not going to be a case where something gets reported to HR and gets looked at and somehow gets buried. Because as a general counsel, I feel that's my responsibility to have some level of oversight here. So I'm aware of all the investigations. I'm aware of what the results, and if I've got questions or problems, I talk to the investigator and look into it further. I also provide regular reporting to the board of directors. So the board knows about they know about the high-level numbers of cases. They know about the types of cases. Any case involving a leader at Airbnb, it is our protocol. I immediately pick up the phone and individually call each member of the board of directors and inform them about the complaint. So there's never going to be anything hidden involving any leader at Airbnb. It's going to go right to the board, and the board is going to get then, we've done it this way, they get regular reports from me on how the investigation's going, and then when we've reached a conclusion, I go to the conclusion with the board as well.
And what's the role of the board in this case? You know, I think that's been something that's been talked a lot about in the media is what role do board members play in holding companies accountable? What role do investors play in holding the companies that they've invested in accountable?
Right. I think that I'll start with the board, and I think it is a critical job for the board to be directly involved in this area and provide oversight. And I think you're going to see in the coming years, I mean, more and more has been placed on boards. Cybersecurity was one, for example, that was a recent area that boards are now being expected to become very familiar with, and to track and make sure that the company is doing the right thing. I think this is as well. And I think that a board is not doing their job if they are not getting regular reports on the types of investigations and on any investigations involving leaders.
Yeah.
And by the way, investors, it's your money. And look, we've seen companies that are literally coming apart over this stuff. Right. If I'm on a board, if I'm an investor, I'm looking at this is my responsibility. I've got to get involved. It's
in your interest.
It's in your financial interest, and I think as a board, you've got a fiduciary duty. Ultimately, it stops with you, and you are the one that's got to be looking out for all of the shareholders in the company. And
Right.
if you're not aware of what's going on, you ought to know what sort of training has been done. What's the company doing in this regard? Do they have their hotline in place? How many reports are they getting? Why are they not getting very many reports? What's happening with the reports that are coming in?
Right.
And what's the company doing to try to get over this barrier? We've got a huge barrier. Women are uncomfortable filing complaints through the normal channels, and we've got to do something about that.
Yep. So I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about, I guess what I would call bro culture. There's a book that came out recently called Brotopia, Breaking Up the Boys Club of Silicon Valley, and it talks a lot about this bro culture, which is, you talked a little bit about it earlier, and it's really that the more subtle forms of sexual harassment. And so I'm curious, what can companies do to try to extinguish that bro culture?
Hire more women in leadership positions.
Yep.
First, I think that diversity in leadership is the most important thing you can do to break up this kind of culture, frankly. And that is so far and away the number one most important thing that I can't emphasize that enough. Now, there are other things. When we talk about what it means to be a leader in a company, we've seen situations where managers are going out and playing golf with a couple of their direct reports on the weekend. And they're hanging out and going out drinking at night with the guys on the weekends. And the message, they think it's okay. Because it's like, hey, Rob, what I do on the weekend is all right. And what we're being very clear about is, no, that's not all right. Being close friends with your direct reports, a couple of your direct reports and not others, sends a horrible message.
Right.
And if it's gender-based, in my mind, it's actually potentially illegal.
Yeah.
You've got to make sure that you've got diversity on the leadership team, and then leaders have to understand the importance of inclusiveness.
Yeah. And this brings me to the next point, which is that, I think that men really do want to participate in this conversation, but they oftentimes don't have, they don't feel comfortable participating because they're afraid that what they say might fall under scrutiny, that it could actually end in a bad outcome for them if they say the wrong thing. So, how can we make men feel more comfortable participating in this conversation?
You know what? There's so much courage that someone has to go through to raise a complaint, I mean, that's courage to me. If you are in a situation where you are being harassed at work,
Right.
And someone is threatening you with silence, and you have no place to go, and you have to trust some hierarchy and a hotline, we're asking women, or we're asking victims to have that level of trust and to come out in courage. I would encourage men, don't be afraid to speak up. If you say something that doesn't come out right, hopefully everyone will understand that your intentions are in the right place.
Yeah.
And so, to me, it's just we cannot be bystanders. And a message that we try to get across at the company: you can't stand on the sidelines on this.
Yeah.
You have an obligation to the company. You have an obligation to your fellow man to step up and make sure. Just like I teach my kids in middle school about bullies. This is bullying. It's adult bullying in a lot of ways. You can't stand on the playground and watch while someone else is abused and treated this way. You got to step in, because if you don't step in, the bully's coming for you. Somebody's got to step up at some point. And like the Me Too movement, there's often power in numbers. So step up next to somebody. Get involved.
And what does that mean? You know, it's calling each other out, pulling a guy aside if you saw something that he did or said in the workplace.
Why not?
Yeah, no,
I mean, right?
I agree.
I think that we all owe it to our fellow employees to make folks feel comfortable at work, get the most out of all employees. And if you see someone getting treated that way, to me it's your obligation. I mean, certainly as a leader, if any leader saw that kind of behavior and didn't act, I'd be really disappointed. But even you shouldn't have to be a leader.
Right.
You should just look and see, just like you were taught on the playground at school. We all learned. Hopefully, we learned empathy. And this is about putting yourself in the shoes of the other person and seeing how they're being treated, and saying, you know what, that's not right. I need to step in and do something about it. And I think it's up to a company to create a culture and encourage employees to do that. Yeah. And encourage people to step up and say, look, you own this culture. We all own this culture. If you see something like this, pull the person aside. Say something to them. Go talk to the victim a little bit and say, hey, that didn't seem right to me. Are you okay? Because frankly, I'm worried. We need safe places where people who are victims of this sort of behavior, we need safe places where they can talk.
Right. And I think that that's really the power of the conversations that you're having internally at Airbnb is, you know, giving men and women a safe space to have those conversations, to ask questions. Because I do think that a lot of the reason why men maybe aren't comfortable participating is because they're not, frankly, educated on the subject, and they need to, learn more. And I think that can happen in the types of forum that you're talking about, but it can also happen more informally. Just ask your colleagues at work, ask your female friends, to help clarify what this issue is really all about. Right. And then I think it's turning inward and evaluating your own behavior a little bit and saying, maybe did I do or say something at some point that made somebody feel uncomfortable, and, trying to self-correct.
I think if you show empathy for others and raise it, generally people will give you the benefit of the doubt and really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So I would say that it's, I don't think it's a great act of courage. I think it's something that we should expect from people.
Yeah. And then I think one final point is not to shy away from women in the workplace. This is something that I think is a reaction that has come out of this movement, is men saying, well, it'd just be easier if I avoid the women in the workplace. That way I don't put myself in a risky position. That's not the right
No, that's
answer.
the wrong answer.
Yeah.
And again, part of this is be intentional about what the rules are. Because if men don't know that, can you ask someone out on a date, and they don't know whether that's right or wrong, then I can understand a little discomfort. So let's make sure that everybody understands the rules at your particular company. Are you allowed to go out on a date with somebody? Are you allowed to ask them out? I mean, at Airbnb, we have the rule that I heard Facebook has the same rule. You can ask someone out once. That's great. If the person says yes, that's terrific, as long as you're not in a reporting line or a power relationship.
And if the person says, I'm busy.
If the person says busy, then that's the end of it.
That's
a
no.
People, and I actually told people when we do the seminars, I say, If you're interested in the person, but you really are busy, then it's on you. Then you're going to need to step up the next time, because you're going to have to understand that, we don't want people to feel uncomfortable at work. And we don't want people like ducking into the bathroom or not going to meetings just because they don't want to see the person because you're afraid you're going to get asked out again and again. So this is to protect you. Ask out once, and that's it. If there's a no, then you've got to move on. I think that's pretty reasonable.
That sounds fair to me.
I'd love to talk a little bit about what you're doing and also about the role of third-party organizations. There's one, an interesting catch-22 that victims of sexual harassment are in a company is there's no safe place to go, right? So they are afraid to report because they feel as though, well, I'm alone. It might be my word against the other person's word. So, and I'm uncomfortable going up against someone in power, particularly when it's just me and my voice. Reporting anonymously has the problems we discussed. One thing that's interesting are these almost a third-party information storage companies, or there are a couple that are out there now. Jillian, again, what I spoke of earlier, a safe place where someone can go and share the experience without worrying that it's going to then have to be reported to HR and have to then get them in trouble.
Right.
So what I am looking for, I think, at Airbnb is what kind of service can we provide to our employees where there's a safe place, a third party, a place where they can go and get advice, learn about what the options are.
Yeah.
Because right now, I think inside of companies, there's a fear and folks aren't doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a number of great organizations out there that provide support to victims. There's, RAIN, which has a hotline that, they're a third party. There's another organization called Better Brave that's focused on, helping provide resources and letting people know what their rights are. At the Purple Campaign, what we're really focused on is, one, as I mentioned earlier, working with companies to help them create change internally. And that's, really starts with cultural transformation, because as we know, this is a cultural problem and it's deeply rooted. And then, also focused on public policy change. But, what we're also starting to do is, I think there's a lot of people that they want to create change in their own workplaces, in their own communities, and there hasn't yet been an organizing function or force to help them do that. And so that's really, a void that we're filling in the Purple Campaign, and that's, organizing action campaigns to help people, kind of funnel their energy and passion for this issue toward real change. And then also creating resources for employees to actually, start a conversation in their own workplace. So not everyone's going to be fortunate to work in a company like Airbnb, where you, as a leader, have, started having these conversations with employees. But I don't think that means that, those conversations can't be happening. I think every employee should feel empowered with the right resources to have those conversations in their own workplace. And so we're helping provide those resources for them to do that.
Right. So you're working directly with companies.
Working directly with companies, and then also giving regular employees, the general public, resources to actually, start having those conversations and create change within their own workplaces.
Right. Yeah, I think one thing we've got to do better, and I think companies need to do better, is help connect employees with these sorts of outside resources, because there's a lack of trust in the internal resources.
Right.
And I'd love to build up the trust in the internal resources, but I've also got to be realistic that people need help.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think our end goal is really, when there is an issue, we want employees, hopefully, to report that internally. So I think that is going to be, the best outcome for them. But in the meantime, if they feel the fear of retaliation is too high, there have to be other options for them.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think, now might be a great time to turn to the audience. I know there were some hands going up earlier as we were chatting, so I will start with you, and I think maybe we can just hand the microphone. Yeah.
Let's take mine.
Yeah, and then we can share.
There we go.
Or we have another one, yes.
I'm healthy. So just a question, it's come up a little bit throughout the talk tonight about using external resources versus internal resources, and I think initially with respect to investigations and using a third party and some other options, but I think that there's a bit of a tension there because who's paying for those resources, and it's the companies. So how do you address that when there might be that skepticism as well from employees who might have a third party investigator come in, but that investigator is being paid by the company and is probably a repeat investigator. So just curious as to how you would respond to that.
Yeah, it's when it comes to having sort of a nonprofit, some place that employees could go. I'm actually looking into this right now. It's got to be part of an employee assistance program, but we have to overcome that fear. It's funny, it wouldn't occur to me to think of it that way, but I think understanding the shoes that a victim is in, we've got to do a very good job of making it clear that this is a third party that is there to help you. They are not the company. This is perhaps it's paid for as part of a general employee assistance program, but it's not paid for on any case-by-case basis. We are genuinely offering this for your benefit and for your help. And by the way, in those resources, they can be completely confidential. I would be fine making employees aware of a resource where they could go that has no obligation to Airbnb at all. They don't have to report anything to us. They are there solely for the person who's been a victim who needs information and help. And I think if we put it that way and say, you know what, we get no information. There's no obligation there. We simply want there to be a place where people can go for help. I'm hoping that would help overcome it. When it comes to an independent investigator in a case, I think the proof you have to prove it through example. I mean, I think early cases are particularly important. You've got no credibility if there's a report and there's an independent investigation and nothing happens and everyone knows something happened. So I think you have to earn it.
Yes, Jillian.
I actually have a question for you, Jessica. So you talked about my SOS line. It's women for the last 3 years, as you know, can text me day or night when they're being harassed or any type of bullying. And over the last 3 years, I have worked with thousands of women, literally just from the Silicon Valley, at 3 o'clock in the morning, at 7 o'clock in the morning, at all hours. It's very interesting. What I've done is I've created a ledger, and I have my top 20 predators here in the Silicon Valley. And then what I do is I connect all the women to each other. If they want to be connected to each other, I connect them. And with the strength in numbers, it's usually they feel comfortable at 3. If there are 3 or more of them, then they are able, I encourage them to help. And some men have toppled here because of this. But I feel that it's important for companies as well as for you, and I'm hoping that maybe this is, because I've seen that it's been incredibly impactful when I've been able to connect the women together so that it's not just them reporting, but some action is taken afterwards where I'll ring up all the other women and say, listen, this happened to so-and-so. Would you feel comfortable in talking to them and potentially taking action together? And this I'd like to see. I've always said that all women, even though, so people just send me a text that says SOS, that's all they have to do to my telephone number, and then for me to call them. And what I'd like for more women to do is actually create their own SOSs in your own communities, in your own network, so that women know in your own that you have an SOS and that people can reach out. With you're developing this product. I'm hoping or wondering, and Rob, maybe you can sound on this, is it possible to add that functionality, if you will, where you could connect with permission the women so that they can feel empowered, similar to how the Me Too, this is mini Me Too movements?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and you know, we definitely know that for so long there have been these repeat offenders who have frankly been protected because women have not been empowered to share their stories, or they've been silenced by NDA agreements, or they have not been allowed to bring their cases into court. And so when a case goes to court, then it becomes public, and so then you can start to connect the dots and see that the same person is and so right. And so I think what you're doing is really powerful in connecting people before they've pursued legal action, for example. Yeah, I think that it's not something that we've. Rob can probably weigh in on whether this is.
I've always thought there should be a Jillian app. But there's on one level, I love the idea that that everyone should have an SOS. And I think on one level that's true. The downside to it is that you miss the benefits of aggregation, right? So if there are 1,000 different people who have SOSs, then you don't have the benefit of being able to connect people. I love the idea of a nonprofit that could play the role not only of counseling and helping people through these situations, but say, look, we will not pass your name along without your permission, but if you're interested, we will connect if we get another complaint involving the same person at the company. Are you interested? Apparently colleges, I read somewhere that colleges actually did this, and it automatically triggered when the second complaint against the same person was filed. The first one got released with a timestamp. Yeah, neat.
So I would love to know more about that. I think that this is really important, that women don't feel alone.
Yes.
And they feel empowered by this support. And I think that needs to be done.
I would listen. I'm torn because part of me would love for the report to come to the company because you want to do something about it, but I have to know and I have to understand, as much as I want that to happen, that there isn't the trust in the company, and there's the discomfort, and I think that I have to, the next best thing, the embarrassment, the isolation, there's so much at play there that I think that a nonprofit that actually played a role like this could be really powerful. Because again, Me Too, the word "to" is where there's the power, right? When you feel as though that you've got a partner, you've got someone else that's been through the same thing that you've been through with the same person, I think that's the isolation falls away at that point, and then you're actually emboldened to stand up. And if there's some nonprofit that could play that function, I would love to be able to promote it, even to employees. It would be hard because I'd want them to go to the hotline primarily, but if they're not comfortable, as a last resort, I want them to get help. That's what's most important.
Yeah.
We got more questions. Oh, you got a mic. Okay.
A lot of questions.
Oh, hi. I have two questions, so I'll make them concise. The first is whether you think businesses will start to have a legal or ethical responsibility to divest from partnering with or working with brands that promote derogatory content or material towards women or any underrepresented or minority group. It's something that is an interesting idea because it expands so rapidly. And I think the second question is, how do you as a parent think that women or young men should talk to people who are older than them or even their parents about the uncomfortable experiences they've had that their parents might not be aware of? Or people who are older. It's a tough question.
I've got a 17-year-old daughter, and I've gone through this. And my daughter, she wants to be an actress too, of all things. And so, part of me has been thrilled with the movement in that sense, because the field of acting has had the reputation that this sort of thing is going on, and I've been worried for my daughter. And I had talked to my daughter about it, and so all these revelations, I think, have made me. I'm hoping that it will raise the standard of behavior in that industry, as in everywhere, as a parent. I've tried to have those conversations with my daughter about what to do. Because I told my daughter, the one thing you've got to do is you've got to prepare for that moment. You've got to prepare for the moment. If someone some predator acts in an aggressive way in the workplace. I would think it's so shocking that you don't know what to do. I would be a little flustered because I'd be so shocked that it happened. And I told my daughter, you need to prepare for that moment. Think about it in advance, because only if you've thought about it in advance do you know what your reaction is going to be. And we've even talked about the reaction, and the reaction has got to be that you've got to be very, very confident and forceful and let that person know that what they just did was out of bounds and not welcome. That's the primary first, show strength, right? And then we talked about a couple of other things that I would tell anyone that goes through this, about taking notes, about what happened immediately thereafter, because a lot of times this can become a debate about facts. But I think preparing for that, having the conversation that you talked about with young people and preparing them for the moment, what would you do if this happened to you, I think would be very positive. And by the way, the other point I thought was a great one as well. At a company like Airbnb, I think we want partners that are consistent with our core values. And having core values is something that's very important to the company. I think it drives what we do, and it's something that we look for not only in what we do internally, but in the partnerships that we choose. We try. I'll also be the first to tell you that we're not perfect. We've got a reporting hotline, and we get reports, and there are issues as well. I don't think any place is immune to it. But I think having a stated intention in that way is a very positive first step, and then we try.
And I think that you raise an interesting point, which is about, the policies that companies have need to extend beyond just the employer-employee relationship. So, not specifically what you were asking about, but I think, we need to make sure that our policies are inclusive of our customer relationships, our partner relationships, vendor relationships. There are so many other people that employees interact with, in the workplace that aren't necessarily employed by the same company as you. And so those relationships need to be covered and protected as well. Other questions? Keely.
Hi. Okay. So you guys talked about the Silicon Valley community. I guess, Rob, did you guys come up with kind of the talks that you're having and the policies and procedures that you put in place yourselves? Are you talking to other tech companies in the community about what they're doing? Is there any type of kind of best practice sharing that's already in place, or do you think there should be? How does that work, I guess?
It's going on in pockets right now, where GCs who know other GCs are talking with each other about it a little bit. What's missing, I think, is a bigger, I hate the word movement, but a broader movement right now isn't there yet. But GCs are talking about it. They read what's going on in the world and understand that the world's changing, and that they need to be part of this and figure it out. So I'm talking to GCs that are friends of mine about, and we're listening to each other's ideas. So yes.
That's really one of the gaps that we're filling at the Purple campaign. We're establishing 3 councils. One is a business and tech council. The second is a law and policy council, and then the third is a labor and workers council. And the idea is to bring together industry experts from these different fields to have them, weigh in on some of the policies that we're recommending for companies and also public policy. And then what we'd also like to do is, on a periodic basis, is bring those 3 separate councils together to actually talk to each other and bridge the gap. Because right now, the public policy is being, determined by lawmakers, and then there's the business folks, and we need to bridge that gap to make sure that their interests are all, represented. Oh, sorry, you have the mic.
Sorry,
Whoever's got the mic has got it.
First, this has been really a great conversation, really just buzzing with ideas. But I had a question with respect to companies that are large enough to have, VC backing, but they don't have general counsel. So, the remedies that you proposed, assuming you're talking about a team that doesn't have a point person, what would you suggest for them, especially if they've tolerated a culture of untouchables?
It doesn't have to be a general counsel, but it needs to be a leader. Somebody who's a leader in a company has got to sit up, take notice of this, and say, I'm going to take responsibility. Head of HR, every company has to have a leader. And by the way, it can be a product person. It can be an engineer. It doesn't matter. But I think it has to be someone who's a leader in the company that people look up to. When that person speaks, everyone understands that what this person says has the weight of the founder, the CEO. It's coming from the top of the company. And I think the message has to. And I think that it doesn't have to be the lawyer. And in fact, in a lot of companies, it isn't necessarily the lawyer.
We actually, at the Purple campaign, we just released 2 sample policies, a code of conduct and an employee agreement. And these can be downloaded on our website, and they're, they can be intended for any size company. Really, we actually put them together in partnership with an organization called Election University that's focused on campaigns, political campaigns. And, at political campaigns, there's obviously the really big campaigns that you hear about, like the presidential campaigns that, of course, have, HR and they have an operations function. But there's so many campaigns out there that might just be one staffer plus the candidate. And those campaigns need to have policies in place just like a small startup might. And so we created these policies just to be, a starting point for, these types of organizations that maybe don't have, an HR function in place.
Size can be an advantage. I mean, the great thing about a small company is that the CEO can call everybody over to the table and say, I've been thinking, I've been doing some reading, and there are some things that I'd like to talk to you about. And in one fell swoop can address it and make a tremendous impact in an hour. So by the same token, if you don't have the strength of character at the top, it can be an extraordinarily difficult situation, I think.
Who has the mic?
Whoever's got the mic.
Well, thank you so much to all the 3 of you for doing these incredible initiatives and for really solving the problem at that point. My question is about are we curing symptoms, and do you have ideas about how we actually cure the root causes for the problem that occurs in the workplace, which doesn't just start there, but is probably a cultural cause that has been, growing and thriving for 20 to 30 years in the people who have the power, and this is for men and women, right? Let's not forget the women in power who also do not abide and help, right? So do you have ideas?
Boy, I don't tend. It's a lot more than 20 to 30 years. It's centuries, right? I mean, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The more power someone has, the more potential there is for abuse. The workplace, I think, has just become a focal point because so much of our world is focused around our work and around companies, and a lot of power is focused in leaders at companies. Well, if I could figure it out outside of the workplace on a broader sense, that would be a great thing. I don't have any. I do think that the conversation that we're having around this, and Me Too, has force and power far beyond the workplace. So in other words, I think that the message is about the way that we treat each other in any sort of a setting. So I think I'm hopeful that everything that we're talking about and all that we're reading about raises awareness about other people's feelings and treating people with empathy and putting yourself in the other person's shoes when you act. So I'm hopeful that the benefits may extend outside the workplace. Yes. Yes. I'm sure I've had an earlier conversation with my kids because of all of this, and particularly because of the profession that she's going into. But I think that's beneficial. I think hopefully it will. She'll be a little better prepared than the average college student when this happens to her, because it will. I mean, statistically, I just know that she's likely to have to encounter this, and I want her to be ready for it. Yes. Oh, yes. My son's 11. We haven't quite had that conversation yet, but we're getting there. We're getting to that age, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's a great point. That the conversation shouldn't be just with daughters; it should be with sons. And it's my son is now just in 5th grade, but we talk about bullying on the playground. We talk about how you treat other people regardless of their sex or the color of their skin or what happens. You stand up for other people. You treat other people like you'd like to be treated. So I'm hoping that the core values that you pick up in kindergarten, like empathy, are actually the foundation for these later conversations. Yeah, it's parenting.
Sounds like I don't need it. So my question is, there's always been a lot of training around, how to mitigate sexual harassment in the workplace. But I think there's a lot of confusion when it's not a really egregious case, where it's sort of subtle, can be a little bit nebulous, and I think women have been taught for so long to sort of power through those moments and push through and take it on the chin. And so you don't really know. That made me feel belittled. Something about that moment wasn't right, but I don't know if it's a reportable offense. How do you deal with those really nebulous cases so that those things are reported, because they tend to escalate if they're not?
Yeah. They absolutely should be reported, and I think that, women need to document what's happening in the workplace when those things happen, and then, go to HR and share what's happening. I think that, leaders in the organization, whether that's, executive level leader or just someone who's a manager, needs to really be watching out for those things happening. That's kind of that bro culture that we were talking about before. And I think men need to take responsibility and hold each other accountable to, kind of call each other out when those things are happening. But, and I think just small things too can make a difference. It's kind of a hack, but, can you do a seating reconfiguration and kind of mix up who sits next to each other? That kind of thing can make a pretty big difference, actually, in, the conversation that's happening just among people at their desks.
I'd love a world where you could immediately say something to the person and be transparent. I love talking to people and being open. If something hits you the wrong way and it feels like it was a little over the line, I mean, if I ever said something unintentionally that were interpreted that way, I would love it if someone would just right there in the moment just let me know about it. And I hope that we have cultures at our workplaces where people are comfortable and encouraged to do that.
Can I just add to that one thing, because this is what I work a lot on with. But what Rob is saying, so there are two things I say to women, and the first thing is, first of all, keep your composure. I say this to all women. The minute that you lose control, okay, is the minute they rob you of your power. So keep that very mindful in the workplace. Don't cry, don't freak out, don't start screaming, keep it together, all right? And with that mindfulness, do exactly what Rob is saying, you know what? Very quietly, very much in control, that really wasn't appropriate. Okay, and just like that, not you son of a bitch, not how dare you say this, not anything like that.
Streaming on the internet.
That's right, that's right. Not posting it, not tweeting it, not anything. I always tell women to stay tenacious but gracious. Okay, so just stay in that moment and say, you know what, that really wasn't right. That really wasn't right. That was offensive to me. Now, the interesting part of the Me Too movement is that actually men cannot come back and say, well, that's so stupid, you say. Of course, because they are on, we're watching them. Sorry to all men. I don't mean to offend Robbie. But you're being watched. So if we bring this to your attention, okay, there are very few men now who are going to be like, well, that's absurd. Don't be like that. Don't be such a biatch, right? Yeah. You're not going to get that as much anymore. There are a lot of men. I have men using my SOS now. I had this one young man who SOS'd me, and he was flipping his lid. And it was funny. Sorry, don't mean to but basically he said to me, Jillian, he said, that was an SOS. I'm a man and I work here, and please, you need to call me back. And I said, okay, I'm going to give that. So I rang him back. He said, I just told a woman that I liked her sweater because it reminded me of my mom's sweater. My mother passed away a while ago, and I just really loved that sweater. And it reminded me, and it was a good feeling. He said, but I think she took it that I was looking at her breasts, and I got him on the phone, and I said, okay, you need to go to that woman and say, it's all about communication. We're lacking communication. We're all in silos now. And the worrisome part about Me Too or any movement is that the men go to one corner, the women go to another corner, and now we're in corners of a ring. And so I think we need to have better communication around. I said, go to her and say, did I insult you? You know, I really didn't mean, just so that you know, this was, if I offended you. So what, Rob, you're saying?
Yeah, in other words, tell the story about the grandmother.
Yes.
And say, you know something, you know, maybe I realized after I said it that you may have, you probably took it the wrong way. It struck me because there was something about the sweater that reminded me of something that someone very dear to me used to wear, and that was very meaningful to me. And I just want you to know that my heart was in the right place. I didn't mean anything sexual by it. But it's that notion again of talking to each other.
Yeah, and so, you know, say it to men. Say, you know what, I think you could, if I misunderstood you, then maybe I did, but it's the way you said it. And so it's really up to us to educate men right now, and to educate our children, our sons, okay, for which I have 3. And I think that's on us to instill the values in these young founders. We always talk at our Structure Capital, we always talk about investing in founders with values, just not valuation. We invest in values, not just valuation. And I think that's a lot of what we need to be doing. So I say to all women, never have anybody steal your power by flipping your lid. Keep it together, communicate the problem with dignity, and that's all I'm going to say on this. But this is something that's really...
Yeah, but and that to me, again, is be prepared. Be prepared. It's going to happen. Now, are you ready for it? What are you going to say? And I think it's a lot easier to be tenacious and gracious, to handle it the way that you're really proud of if you've thought about your response in advance. Because, boy, if that hit me out of the blue, someone did something like that, I think I'd be so shocked, I don't know what I'd do. Really.
So I think this question is partly for you, Rob, but for everyone else as well, because I was recently at a blockchain event where there had been some misconduct sexually, and it was written up about, and we were discussing the article. And at that time, actually, it was interesting, a few women in the space actually brought up the concept of a counsel, an unbiased counsel you could go to, and both sides could talk about it, and it didn't have to go to legal action. It didn't have to go to a formal complaint.
Yeah.
I know, so that's why
You know,
I thought it was
within a company. So the problem is, I think within a company, even a council, if there's anyone from any form of leadership or management on that council, they now have a legal obligation to report it. So that's why we talk about a third party. I'm not wild about sending it out, but legally that may be the best option.
As a community, I mean, third party immediately, I think we brought up some of the things that people fear. Who's funding it, this and that. And so again, this isn't a well thought out idea. It was just something I heard about. But these things happen in other circumstances outside of work as well. And so I think that is even a peer council where we all can discuss these things and get advice. So maybe it's more of a community thing we put together as well.
Even your friends. I mean, we all need to be there for each other. Everyone who goes through this needs a safe place. And the problem is there's not a safe place at work. Because HR, unfortunately, I mean, HR is there for the company. A manager or a leader who you might want to go to for advice is under a legal obligation to then take what you say and go talk to someone. And everyone wants to do the right thing, but unfortunately, within the company, there may not be that safe place.
Okay, so maybe I'm talking about a third party, but
which is why I get back to this idea of a community outside of work or a third party that can fulfill that function.
Okay.
Right?
We're on to something. Let's do this, you guys.
And I think we have time for just 2 more questions. So we'll go here and then to you.
So talking about doing the right thing and being somebody who's sort of in a role of trying to help the company do the right thing, I've seen situations where networks have been activated. You find out that a candidate maybe was terminated from a prior position, but you don't know the details, right? So you don't know what happened. You can't investigate, but you're on maybe some notice, legal notice, maybe not, but whatever. You're trying to do the right thing, and you don't want to bring somebody in. How do you handle that?
We've had this. We've had situations. Obviously it's hard, but I know what we do. We pass. Yeah. We pass on. Yeah. We passed on a number of candidates where we found out through people that you know or through reference checks and the like. You find out about it, and it's a little troubling because you want to be fair. You don't want to be relying on hearsay, proof. But unfortunately, in this world, that's all you got. No one takes the results of investigations and posts them on the internet and gives a LinkedIn profile, a scarlet letter, right? I mean, it's so. Unfortunately, you're put in a position with a company if you see some smoke with a candidate, you back off.
Yeah.
Oh no!
No.
Oh, I'm talking about perpetrators
The perpetrator.
only. Oh, not a victim. Oh, a victim would have no impact. I mean, my personal view, I would respect someone that stood up for themselves as a victim. I'm talking about as a perpetrator.
I don't think every company would deal with that necessarily.
I can tell you, I've been in the room with the founder of the company where there was a candidate that we liked, and then the information came up, and we sat and we talked about the information. We talked about how we felt as far as its reliability. Obviously, it was nothing we could prove. And the answer was pass.
Yeah.
It's not worth it. And there's a part of me that feels like that may not be fair, but in this world, that's the best. That's the only evidence I've got, unless there's actually a published lawsuit on the case. So we pass. That's what we do.
Yeah.
We have one more back there, right?
Right there.
So I want to go back to a comment that she made, which is, are we treating the symptoms or are we fixing the problem? And both of you earlier, maybe I'm incorrect, maybe it was just you, made the comment that really the solution here is having more women in senior level roles at the organization. There's an abundance of data that there is a glass ceiling for women in tech, and that women don't make it to those senior levels, and that they actually leave the industry because they get discouraged because they don't get advanced. So my question is, what are we doing about that? And how are we going to fix that problem? Because that will really help to fix a lot, maybe not all, but a lot of the problems that we're talking about in this room.
You want to take
No, it's a great question, and the data certainly shows that. I think just really quickly what that data is. I think women are leaving tech twice as fast as men, and they're not leaving the workforce. They're just going to other industries. And we also know that the pay gap is 5 times worse in tech than the national average. So you're absolutely right, and there's many more statistics that we could go on and on about. I think that, to solve that problem, number one, we need to take a really hard look at our hiring practices. We need to take a look at our performance reviews, how those are conducted, and also work distribution. How is work even getting distributed within a company? Are women getting the same opportunities to work on the high impact projects that are visible by senior leaders as men are? I think those are some of the initial steps, and companies really do need to look at those practices very closely and make some real changes.
Yeah, I think companies need to understand that you'll have a better company.
Yeah.
You really will. I mean, the company's better for it. If everybody in the room comes from the same background and thinks the same way, and then they're all agreeing, then you've got a big problem. I love my team right now. I report to a woman, and half my direct reports are women and half are men. It's a great collegial group with lots of different perspectives and lots of different ways of looking at the same problem. And I think the more people can realize that you've got a better team and you're going to be more effective, the more people will affirmatively seek it out and make it a priority to do that. And I don't think I don't think it's an easy overnight solution, but we start in our immediate circle, and we build teams that reflect what we think is going to create the right environment and be very effective. And for me, that's a very diverse, balanced team. I believe it. We just need to get there. We have a question.
Okay, we'll take one more. Final word.
On your comment of passing on, prospective candidates in your referrals, how, in your experience, and then maybe what the standard practice is in terms of investors and board members, in terms of vetting your investors in a company or your board members, and what is that position? I
had one issue in my career, a real problem, where a board member was admitted to some horrible misconduct under oath at a trial, publicly while they were a board member. And I went to the board member and had a discussion and said, look, I'd like for you to step down. And he refused. Said, look, I've got a right as an investor to be on this board, and I'm not going to step down, and there's no morals clause. And there is no morals clause, by the way. This was not anything unusual. Every investor that I've looked at and talked to, when they join a board, they have a contractual right to join a board through an investment, and there's no clause in there that says that they will agree to step down if they engage in certain sorts of misconduct. I hate that. I think there should be. Unfortunately, when you are negotiating with investors for money, and they say flat out, we're not agreeing to that. It's not in any other of our hundreds of deals, and we're not going to do it here. You're in a tough situation, being the first to ask for it. But I would love it if that were a standard clause. I think that would be terrific.
I think it's ironic.
Sure.
It's a double standard.
I will say this. Let me say this about it. If it were a board member, our board members, and this I think is pretty standard throughout the Valley, are subject to the same code of ethics as every employee. And so if a board member were on the board as an independent board member, not through investment, as an independent board member, then they could be voted off by the other board members. They would be subject to the same code of ethics. And I feel good about that. What I do think is a problem when you're dealing with private companies and members of the board, they're on the board because they have a contractual right. I would love to see the standard clause for that contractual right to be subject to some form of a morals clause. I would love to get there, and I'm not in a position at the moment. Obviously, we're not taking on any new board members. I'd love to try. I tried one time, and doing something new in this regard is tough because the investors simply say, I've never done it in any one of my hundreds of deals. I've never heard of any investor doing it anywhere else, so I'm not going to put myself in that position. And then the problem is, what do you do as a company if you need the money? Then don't take the money, right? Then, yeah, maybe you're in that position. Yeah, maybe you should. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. I think you would do it. I'm not putting you on the spot, but I think as an investor, I think if you were on a board, I think you would say, you know what, if I engaged in misconduct, if I violated the code of ethics of a company, or if I were convicted of a crime, I would step down from the board. I think you would do it, and I would urge any investor to do that for the good of the company. Good. Okay. That's a good tone. It's a good point to end
On that
Right.
note,
Thank you.
thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for your great questions.